Good evening. Welcome to our spiritual pilgrimage workshop series, Sacred Traditions times God Box Talks, Afro Latinx and Africans, a spiritual reconnection. So we made it to workshop number 2, shifting Afro-Indigenous cultural identities during the transatlantic slave trade. My name is Sabine Blazin. I'm the Director of Programs here at CCCADI. Our mission as an arts, culture, education, and media organization, we advance cultural equity, racial and social justice for African descendant communities. This is part of our larger theme of our African diasporic journey. This is also part of our programming connected to sacred traditions, one of our spiritual pillars and series dedicated to advocating for the education and preservation of African-based spirituality. At this time, I would like to take a moment of silence for our African and Indigenous diasporic ancestors, also in honoring the land. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists, Monica Cadena, Elisa Flecker, our co-moderators and Godbox partners, Afia Reynolds, Gilbert Kobina, Bohari, the CCCADI team for making this all possible, and to you all, our extended family attendees, for being here tonight. I would like to now hand it over to our partner Godbox, Afia Reynolds. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine, and good evening, everyone. As Sabine said, my name is Afia Reynolds. I'm the Associate Director at the God Box, a Pan-African inter and multi-faith organization. We're excited to have you with us for the second panel, and we wanted to take a brief moment to provide a few reminders for all of our participants. When you completed your registration, you were asked to create login information. You can use those same credentials to access articles, art, and other materials to help encourage your exploration of the topics that we're reviewing in each month. We encourage you to make video or written submissions on the same portal so that you can engage with one another in the Godbox and CCCADI teams between each session. The second reminder is that this special program culminates with the spiritual pilgrimage tour to Ghana, this July 23rd to August 5th. The trip will include visits to sacred sites, participation at the historical Panafest, and other meaningful moments along the way. And we're really excited to offer this opportunity, not just for participants of this program, but also for the folks in Ghana who we'll be meeting and connecting with. It's a unique opportunity, and we want to be sure everyone has all they need in order to make this trip happen. So the first logistical piece is that you want to be sure you secure your spot on this tour by submitting your $500 deposit. Unfortunately, there are a limited number of spots available for this particular tour, so please be sure to complete your registration and submit that deposit before all the spots are taken up. We do recognize that the commitment to the pilgrimage experience is a monetary investment, one we hope that you'll make in yourself. So we want to encourage folks to reach out to our team to discuss options for building customized payment plans. And we deeply believe in adding practical experiences to accompany the more research and conversational experiences that we're having in these Zoom sessions. So we'd love to find a way to make this trip possible for you. Please reach out to our team to design your payment plan and make your deposit so that you can join us this summer in Ghana. In order to keep the focus on tonight's program, we'll be dropping information later in the chat. We'll give you the email address where you can ask your questions about the tour, payment plans, etc. And we'll also send you the link to the tour information page. So we're excited to continue this exploration of Afro-Latinidad and African identity with you. Thanks again for joining us for round 2. And Bianca, I'll pass it to you to carry us ahead.
Thank you so much, Afia. My name is Bianca Velez. I am the Director of Communications at the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, also known as CCCADI, and I am pleased to be your moderator tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us and thank the team for putting together what is going to be a very enriching and enlightening conversation. And I'd like to introduce our panelists by reading a couple of bio points that do not do justice, of course, because these are very experienced panelists with so much to offer to tonight's conversation and to the conversation that we're having at a larger scale beyond tonight. I would like to welcome to tonight's panel, Elisa Fluker. She's Afro-lesbian, anti-racist Black feminist with a background in anthropology from the National University of San Marcos in Lima, Peru. Elisa is the co-founder of Presencia y Palabra, Mujeres Afroperuanas, and creator of the Instagram page Lea Mujeres Negras, an anti-racist proposal and dissemination of writings and epistemologies of Black women, Afro-descendants, and of the African diaspora. Also joining us today is Mónica Cadena, an Afro-Chicana, California-based artist, writer, plant ally, working within the intersections of Indigenous sovereignty, food systems, and she's also a wellness advocate through a decolonial lens. Mónica is the former co-founder of Wear Your Voice magazine. She's passionate about highlighting stories from those at the intersections of healing and social justice activism and centering healing-based initiatives. Also with us today is Gilbert Kobina Boheri, director of the God Box Foundation, our partners in putting all of this together. Kobina is a systematic theologian specializing in Pan-African religions from Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. After being mentored by the late and great founder of Black theology, Dr. James Cone, and the contemporary world-renowned scholar, Dr. Cornel West, Kobina's theological journey took him on many travels around the Pan-African world, engaging in intellectual and experiential conversations. And I'm going to toss it to Kobina in just a moment, who's going to get our conversation kicked off. But first, I want to set the context for tonight's conversation, which is one of 4 parts in a series that we've put together to lead discussions about Afro Latinx identity as it relates to their origins in Africa and the diaspora. And these are not new conversations, right? These are conversations we've been having for decades and even longer than that. And at CCCADI, we've been having them since the start of our founding. And we're using this time and this series to very intentionally examine how Africanisms have synchronized, evolved, and been retained within certain aspects of Afro Latinx, Latino identity, culture, tradition, and spirituality within their geographic locations. Our series is led by fantastic expert panelists who are very knowledgeable in the topic and are going to help us explore the history of Afro Latinx and Africa pre and post transatlantic slave trade. Ultimately, we hope that we lead discussions that inspire and influence participants to return home to the continent of Africa with us on our spiritual pilgrimage in July, and invest creatively, culturally, spiritually, and even financially in our collective Afro futures. With that said, I would like to kick it over to Kobina, who is going to transition us from where we left off in workshop 1 and kick off the conversation for today's workshop. Go ahead, Kobina.
Thank you, Sister Bianca. So in our first session, we established a couple of things. We established that there was, in fact, no doubt that there was Africans who migrated from the continent to the Americas way before Columbus, way before the slave trade, and indigenized in those geographical spaces. Those people became the Mayans, Incas, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, and other Native American tribes. They carried African intentions that showed in the cultural, anthropological nature of their belief systems, their morals, values, most importantly, their spirituality, which we attributed to our ancestors. And I believe Dr. Dosser in the first session made a really interesting point that regardless of the change in geographical locations, our physiology in terms of our skin color, our hair, that what we do have always maintain is our spirituality. And in fact, he connected our spirituality with the ancestors and the ancestral spirit that we kind of hold within our consciousness, or better yet, subconsciousness. And they always, that always remains the same no matter where we go as African peoples. So some of the similarities, or shall I say, identifying marks that show, who we are in terms of our, communal way of life, our own reverence for ancestors, African cultural attentions that manifest even in our structures that we build. I think there was a connection that we made even with the pyramids that the Egyptians and the Mayans built, similar, probably around the same time as well. And speaking of the Mayans and Africans, we even touched at the end on movies such as the Black Panther movie and Wakanda Forever, which we, noted that, also proved that we had common roots. We had, common belief systems, spirituality, culture, common enemy, and common interest. And so you would assume that with all of that, we would have a common destiny, and yet somehow, even in the movies, they always find a way to pin us against each other. They did it with the Black Panther movie, where Africans were pinned against African Americans, and then they found a way to do it again with the Wakanda Forever movie, where Africans were pinned against the Mayans, the indigenous folks in America. So I've always found it quite interesting that somehow we always find a way to uphold morals and values when we're dealing with white folks and our oppressors, that we never want to. We hold these non-violent beliefs, but somehow we don't hold those same values and morals when it comes to dealing with each other. We're always ready to fight each other, and I think that's something that we should take note of. With being able to address the cultural anthropological connections in the first session between Africans and indigenous Africans in America, in the Americas, again, with the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs, and other Native American tribes. One thing I don't think we really touched on was the physical anthropological connection. So we spoke about the cultural, but we didn't necessarily talk too much about the physical. And obviously that was because we didn't have who we needed, which is our sister Eliza here, who's an expert in anthropology and physical aspects of it. And we're trying to make that connection, not only from Africans to indigenous folks in the Americas, but how that connects to the Afro Latinx community. And this again is even before even before the Atlantic slave trade, and then kind of transitioning into the Atlantic slave trade. So with that said, I am grateful that we have Sister Lisa here with us, and we're fortunate to have her give us about a short presentation to get us started. So Sister Lisa, I hand it over to you.
Muchísimas gracias, hermanos, hermanas. Primero quiero partir agradeciendo esta invitación. Es un honor para mí poder sumarme a esta iniciativa, ¿sí? Al mismo tiempo, para mí es gratificante y quiero honrar también a mis abuelas, a mis ancestras. Quiero nombrar a Victoria Santa Cruz, que quizás es una de las personalidades afroperuanas más relevantes o reconocidas. Victoria Santa Cruz, estamos en el año todavía su centenario de vida y creo que nos trajo lecciones justo de conexión humana. Victoria Santa Cruz nos deja a través de su legado, de su trabajo, un llamado hacia el ritmo, conectar con el ritmo como un espacio de sanación, como un espacio de conexión ancestral y sobre todo como un espacio de resistencia y libertad. Victoria lo decía, las personas africanas, los afrodescendientes, nunca fueron esclavizados porque no esclavizaron su ritmo. Y eso es lo que ha perdurado y eso es lo que ha permitido sanarnos. Ahora, igual, no sé si tienen por ahí la presentación o me habilitan, yo puedo compartir la pantalla, porque quería hacer algo muy breve para poder situarnos en un contexto más desde lo físico también y territorial. Perfecto, voy a compartir. Aquí está. Entonces, bueno, primero esta es la fotografía justo de Victoria. Es importante que nuestros rostros vuelvan a nuestro propio reflejo. Y porque vamos a hablar un poquito de eso. Me parecía importante hablar de conexiones territoriales también, no solo el cuerpo, ¿no?, como el espacio físico en donde nos reconocemos, sino el territorio, porque creo que las conexiones fundamentales entre pueblos originarios africanos con pueblos originarios del Abya Yala pasan porque somos gente del territorio, gente que es tierra, gente que también es árbol, gente que también es pasto. Y entonces ubicarnos en estas dimensiones en el mapa también nos va a permitir distinguir conexiones del África con nuestras costas atlánticas y caribeñas, del Abya Yala, y también con la parte del Pacífico, costas del Pacífico, ¿no? Porque son rutas distintas. La conexión, y por eso es, justo lo nombraban antes, la conexión de los olmecas, ¿no? Si tenemos la representación de estas cabezas de piedra gigantes, inmediatamente identificamos a una persona con un fenotipo afrodescendiente o africano, ¿no? A mí me ha tocado estar en el Museo de Antropología e Historia en México y muchísima gente afrodescendiente de distintos lugares tomándose una foto diciendo, yo estoy ahí, eso soy yo. Y eso nos habla de un intercambio y de un registro importante. Aquí en el Perú, desde donde yo estoy, estamos en otra situación que tiene que ver con que somos costa Pacífico. Y entonces la costa Pacífico tiene un determinante importante, la cordillera de los Andes. Si ven en el mapa más grande, hay como una masa gris, y la cordillera es nuestra columna vertebral del continente, pero divide al mismo tiempo el continente. Porque hablamos que los pasos de la cordillera están sobre los 4.000, 5.000, 6.000 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Entonces delimita 3 regiones marcadas. En Perú lo vivimos así: la costa, la sierra y la Amazonía. Esto ha permitido igual muchos desarrollos, muchos pueblos, cada uno controlando recursos naturales y adaptándose a su propio medio y construyendo y enriqueciendo sus culturas. Pero esto también ha sido determinante para la trata esclavista y para cualquier intercambio con el continente. Y lo digo porque pueden ver en el primer mapa, esto es la extensión del Tahuantinsuyo. El Tahuantinsuyo es el imperio incaico. Entonces, en América, en el Abya Yala, reconocemos a los mayas, a los aztecas en las zonas del centro y norte, como grandes civilizaciones, y luego está los incas al sur. Los incas extendieron su territorio en lo que ahora es Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, Chile y Argentina. ¿Y qué es lo que va después a situar el virreinato del Perú por parte de la colonia española, ¿no? Pero podemos ver cómo hay una relación de que Perú, al igual que México, que Bolivia y Guatemala, somos los países que actualmente tenemos más población indígena. En Perú somos cerca de 7 millones de personas que se autoidentifican como indígenas, los cuales pertenecen a más de 80 pueblos. donde los quechuas, que son descendientes de los incas en este caso, son el mayor pueblo en número. Lo importante es que después de los quechuas en el Perú, es la población afrodescendiente quien ocupa el segundo lugar. Entonces hablamos que hemos sobrevivido, hemos resistido, hemos trascendido en el tiempo a través justo de este mestizaje, ¿no? En este caso, hablar de mestizaje desde los territorios que han sido indígenas y que han vivido esta convivencia hispano, indígena y africana, el mestizaje también es un resultado que no te da blanqueamiento necesariamente, ¿no? Sino que te da esta mezcla de indígena y afrodescendiente, o indígena e indígena. En los debates en el censo, habían compañeras que decían, pero mi mamá es del pueblo amazónico Chipibo y mi papá es del pueblo quechua. Soy mestizo. Y entonces era un debate del, ¿eres mestizo? Sí, pero también eres indígena, ¿no? Y entonces es un debate muy grande porque en este saco grande del mestizaje, entonces ocurrió entramos todos y al mismo tiempo nos volvemos algo homogéneo. Que nuestro trabajo desde la sociedad civil, desde el activismo ha sido vamos a nombrarnos, vamos a reconocer que nuestros cabellos pueden tener el rulo, pero quizás es más suelto. Que tenemos ciertos fenotipos afros, pero otros más indígenas, pero otros más asiáticos, y nos reconocemos. Y dentro de eso nos reconocemos como afrodescendientes, pero también como personas, de alguna forma, solo indígenas, personas blancas, personas mestizas urbanas, rurales. Entonces es una complejidad muy grande, pero al mismo tiempo nos reconocemos. Lo decía el hermano Comín, o sea, nos miramos en la calle y sabemos por el gesto del cuerpo, por el tipo de hebra, el cabello, quién somos. Y quizás nos sonreímos y en ciertos espacios que nos sentimos inseguros, inseguras, nos juntamos, aún sin tener un vínculo real, ¿no? O preexistente. Nos buscamos. Para cerrar, este es un mapa de más o menos las rutas, las principales rutas esclavistas, ¿no? Y entonces me parece importante situar dónde está Perú. Como lo ven, hace de que las principales desembarcaciones fueron hacia el Atlántico, hacia el Caribe. Las costas pacíficas tuvieron dos rutas diferentes, hasta tres. Algunas por tierra, desde las zonas de Venezuela, bajando hacia las costas nortes del Perú, y otras desde el sur, subiendo por Chile, o sea, por Argentina, Chile, y cruzando la cordillera por esas zonas. También por barco, pero haciendo el cruce en Panamá y bajando. Eso hace que son lugares donde la población esclavizada llegó o bien siendo criolla, ¿no? Que ya habían nacido dentro de las Américas, o bien desde una segunda trata, ¿no? Primero en un primer mercado y luego hacia los otros territorios. Esto es importante porque ha hecho que hacia nuestros territorios, muchas veces nos preguntan ¿y ustedes también tienen candomblé, tienen santería? Y nosotros decimos, no, no está el candomblé, no está la santería como una organización espiritual, pero no quiere decir que no estén nuestros vínculos con los territorios, con deidades, ¿no? Que tienen que ver con el agua, con los ríos, con el bosque. Porque en estos vínculos que pueden ser desde preexistentes a la colonia española, los pueblos originarios de estas zonas también son vinculados al territorio. Y creo que ahí reside un tema fundamental para que el encuentro entre la población indígena del Abya Yala y las personas esclavizadas, pero también los africanos, africanas que emprendieron rutas de intercambio, haya sido sostenida en el tiempo, es que nos consideramos gente de la tierra, nos consideramos gente que es parte de la naturaleza y que busca este bien común, y que de alguna forma lo conversaba en algún momento con unas amigas que llegaron de Cuba y decían, pero son un país marrón, y porque también tiene que ver eso, entre indígenas y afrodescendientes, lo que más varía es el pelo, el cabello, el marcador del cabello, pero nos reconocemos en la piel, nos reconocemos en los cuerpos, y también hemos tenido que lidiar con procesos de colonización que nos han planteado ustedes no deberían llevarse bien, ustedes deberían desconfiar entre sí. Tal cual lo nombraba Covina, ¿no? Tenemos esto de, como cuando hemos visto Wakanda Forever, esta idea del ustedes no se vinculen con ellos, ¿no? Deben desconfiar porque también tienen el recurso natural, porque también tienen la capacidad de conectar con su territorio. Y el gran desafío contemporáneo es el tejer esa resistencia de manera colectiva. Entonces yo quería llegar hasta aquí para situar también esta conversación y no olvidarnos que somos un territorio de dinámicas riquísimas, en donde los pueblos indígenas del Abya Yala son muy grandes, son diversos y han sobrevivido en realidad a tiempos muy duros y han trascendido en el respeto a la vida desde el respeto a la Pachamama, ¿no? A la Madre Tierra y a todos los recursos naturales que nos hacen seguir viviendo. Gracias.
Wow. Wonderful. That was powerful. Thank you, Sister Elisa. Again, it's interesting how, we don't speak about our resistance enough. Oftentimes we talk about what happened to us and all this stuff, but we don't necessarily speak on the resistance. And as you're saying, regardless of where we're indigenizing in those geographical spaces, sometimes we get a bit confused with the titles that we put on these different, kind of, as you were saying, organizing spirituality. So whether it's candomblé, whatever you want to call it, there's still that same sense of spirituality that exists amongst the indigenous spaces, regardless of what you want to call it. And I think that's pretty powerful. So thank you for that.
I want to jump in and I want to kick it over to Monica to hear, after Elisa's presentation, which struck so many chords. There's so much powerful information to take away from her presentation. I mean, we're hearing, post-Atlantic slave trade, we're hearing enduring, we're hearing divide and conquer and the residual effects of that. We're hearing, I love the way she started us off with, the Africans never had their rhythm enslaved, right? And how those retentions remain. You see it in the music across the entire region that's known as Central and South America. So I want to know from you, Monica, what are some of those strong chords that were struck for you throughout this presentation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that presentation, Elisa. And just want to uplift, the spirit of this conversation of, we've never been away from our ancestral lands. We're always here and we occupy every space because, I don't want to say we're the first Indigenous people, and also just want to uplift and recognize, the history and lineage of the African diaspora before colonialization. Oftentimes when we start these conversations, it's like post-colonialism, and that's actually my lens, and I'll share a little bit why, but I just want to uplift that. And something that struck a chord with me is really recognizing our role before enslavement, because oftentimes that's where our history and lineage starts. And as someone, I identify as Afro-Chicana. If you go back
to that map that was shared, you can see like South America and Africa are very close. But if you're thinking about like a game of telephone, right, you know, the further away you get, you lose a little bit more of like the original conversation. Mexico is like, Mexico is North America. And so as someone who, you know, my mother's Mexican, my father is Black, I've often, like when I used to say, you know, I'm Afro Latina, are you Dominican, Puerto Rican? And so recognizing, you know, the level of anti-Blackness that comes specifically in Mexico, because we've been denied, we're so far away from where many of us originally came from. Fun fact, you know, there's actually more descendants of the African slave trade in Latin America than in the United States. And I'm centering the United States because that's where I'm located. And wanted to say all of that to say is, when we start focusing on pre-colonialization or post-colonialization, excuse me, as like the starting point, it's because we've been robbed our humanity to the point that we're often not even seen. And so like a lot of the conversations I talk about is, what does it even mean to be Indigenous? Who is recognized as being Indigenous? A show that I absolutely love. My partner just got me onto it. It's called Res Dogs. And there's even conflicts of like, who are the people from Turtle Island specifically who are not seen in that? Because there's a huge history of, you know, people who even like post-colonialism, because sometimes you don't even want to deny us like the history of like before. Post-colonialism, there is a huge, deep relationship between folks who were enslaved peoples from Africa and people who identified as Native Americans. But we're often not even seen, we're often not even represented. Like even going back to what Eliza said, like as simple as not seeing our hair texture or not seeing our skin color or not even seeing our culture represented, because we don't even know what the starting point looks like. So just kind of recognizing like, what is our starting point when we talk about, you know, the role of the African diaspora within Latin America. And, you know, as we expand on this conversation, I like to center a lot of my dialogue from specifically not even just as someone who's a descendant of people from Mexico and Africa, but even looking at the United States specifically, and what does it look like within current social movements. I'm thinking of, you know, the Brown rights movement and the Black liberation movement. What are the shared commonalities and how do we fight for that struggle collectively and together? What is the history of even the move, like the farm movement? A lot of people talk about like that's Chicano culture, like that's the farm labor right movement, but there's a whole history of folks of the African diaspora have been fighting for sovereignty and land, who have been fighting for access to, you know, steward the land as sharecroppers, as people who come from agriculturally rich backgrounds, that we are also a part of these conversations as well. So it's about even in this conversation about reclaiming, how are we reclaiming even in these social liberation spaces? Because we're, even though they're like, so like I'm here for Black rights, there's still that division of not even seeing the interconnectedness of the two. And so just another thing I want to lift up, and it's just a fun fact. And so like in the spirit of fun facts, like growing up, I grew up in the valley of California, Stockton, California. My family is from Oakland though, so I'll give myself the street creds. And, you know, if you think of like a summer in California, whether it's Los Angeles or Stockton or Fresno, you know, like going to, you know, the flea market or street vendors, we're often like, oh, my favorite thing to drink was horchata. Like to this day is horchata. And I don't know if y'all have seen this recent Instagram or this reel or this TikToker who does a lot of conversation around the African influence of culturally rich foods in Latin America. But we often see things like horchata is like, oh, that's like that's a Mexican drink. It actually originates from Africa. And so like, if we start to unpack like a lot of these things that we hold on, like, this is my culture, this comes from Mexico. But if we fail to unpack its origins, we won't even see the beauty of our expansiveness. And so going back to that interconnectedness, just wanted to share that fun fact with y'all. So those were some initial thoughts that came up for me. Thank you so much for sharing. I love all of that. I love how you're talking about unpacking, and that's like exactly what we want to do here. And that's exactly why we want to have this series. And I thank you guys for, lifting up as well that our history did not begin with enslavement, right? And so when we talk about the indigenous communities, the African descendant communities within Latin America, that's not where it started. But we also have this transition over time into identities. And you touched on this, Monica, right? Where horchata is seen as Mexican. And we have this formation, which when you really look at it as recent history, we have this formation of these identities, these national identities, or Latino identity versus Black identity. And as of late, we're hearing, Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latinx. And so when we're looking at the formation of these identities and what is the Afro-Latinidad nation today, I'd love to hear from you guys in your thoughts in the creation of this. And I think it brings a lot of benefit to lifting up the conversation about identity and doing that unpacking that you're talking about, Monica. I also think that we find ourselves in the weeds of words and semantics and trying to navigate those spaces. Covina, I'd love to kick it over to you to start us on the path of that conversation as we look at identity and the differentiations between terms that continue to change over time. And one is that we're looking at right now is Afro-Latinx.
Thank you. No, what I actually was thinking about was sometimes, especially listening to Sister Monica, sometimes how reclaiming identity, whether there's a negative side to it, or aspect to it. Because again, in our last session, we kind of made a distinction between originating and indigenizing in spaces, right? And so sometimes when we're reclaiming an identity and we want to go all the way back to Africa, some folks may feel that that somehow also sort of erases the indigenous or the indigenous identity, right? And so, and I think that's important, that's something that we should maybe tap into and discuss, because it is a conversation where, and it's part of it's a part of the struggle or the wrestle of claiming to be indigenous in these spaces, taking those and claiming those identities, but then somehow coming to the realization that by claiming this indigenous identity, if you're going to go further back into those original identities, right, or where you originated. So case in point, somebody may really want that food to be Mexican, right? It's like that's claiming that, and so taking it back to Africa and saying, no, actually, it's over there, might somehow, some way take away from what it means to be indigenous and Mexican and all of that creation. So, I'm curious to see how, Sister Monica, you can speak on that a little bit, and then we can go to Sister Eliza as well.
Yeah, thank you for uplifting that. And that's another thing I want to name is when I do a lot of these conversations on what does it mean to be Indigenous, it's a lot of the basis what I talk about. And I always center Blackness, even in my reclaiming of, my roots, whether it comes from Mexico or of course the diaspora of Africa specifically, because anti-Blackness exists everywhere. Like that's a point blank, even internalized anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness exists everywhere. So that, if we really want to talk about Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship, we have to unpack how we internalize things through the lens of anti-Blackness. And I really hate that if you've never heard of this term, that I'm going to be the one to introduce you to this, but it's called WABO. So when we talk about the African influence, pre-colonialism, a lot of the rhetoric back from people, a lot of, people who are reclaiming, they're reclaiming their indigeneity. It's happening a lot, specifically within Mexican Americans, because word, of Turtle Island, but we're not seen as Indigenous, we're not seen as Native American because we're detribalized. They will call folks, when even this conversation, they would say like, oh, that's an aspect of a Wabo because you're stealing, you have no influence of the Mayans, you have no influence of the Aztecs, that's not your lineage, you're taking, you're stealing. However, it's really understanding that that lens is even rooted in the colonialism that they say that they're trying to step away from. And so it's like, how do we unpack these layers that are intrinsically rooted in anti-Blackness? It's not even a matter of whether we're reclaiming or co-opting or taking. It's really, how do we deprogram the things that said that we shouldn't even be represented in this in the first place? And so that is really what I think is important to center when we have these conversations. And then, of course, like, because I understand that a lot of people start from that, I'm like, all right, well, let's talk about specifically people who come from mixed identities like myself. Like, I have a more direct lineage to my, my Indigenous roots, whether it's from Africa or Turtle Island. And so like, even in the erasure of saying that you don't belong here, that erases people like me, people like Eliza, who have like direct connections to this. We don't have, and I always tell people, we don't have to go back 500 generations. We are still here today. And, I think that a lot of people, because of this role of hypodescent and hyperdescent, we don't see ourselves because we've been conditioned to not see ourselves. So if you even like look at Costas, which were these lineage paintings, it's like from the 1700s, these lineage paintings, they would have mestizo, a mixed woman of African and Spanish descent. She would be with her Spanish husband, and they would have their presenting white baby, and the mother of the mixed woman would be looking like she's so happy because the child doesn't have to take on the Black identity. And so even if it's not that direct, it still exists today in us, like saying, you're not really this, you're not really that, of like acknowledging we are part of something. There is an interconnectedness. And if we fail to see how these things intrinsically tie together, not only are we denying ourselves of the richness of our history, but we are perpetuating the same things that we say that we're against.
Sí, yo de todas maneras quería también compartir un poco esto de cómo convivir finalmente, ¿no? Estas identidades, cómo convivir y sin esta disputa que nos han impuesto, que es quién es el original, ¿no? Porque pareciera que la disputa es, entonces, ¿quién fue primero, el africano o el del Abya Yala? Que podríamos entrar en un debate incluso con pueblos originarios asiáticos también, ¿no? Creo que ahí es importante algo que yo aprendí sobre todo con organizaciones de mujeres indígenas en Perú, fue el renarrarnos como pueblos originarios. En África también son pueblos originarios, ¿no? Las poblaciones antes de la colonia eran pueblos originarios de África. Y por eso creo que es muy bonito lo que se da en Perú. Siempre he dicho que es un territorio muy indígena, muy originario. Nosotros en nuestros vocablos, al hablar, usamos aún palabras quechuas cotidianamente, ¿no? Así no seamos descendientes de quechuas. Nosotros a los niños, niñas recién nacidos les decimos guaguas, que es bebé. Y entonces hablamos de tu guagua, mi guagua, las guaguas están jugando, ¿no? Y usamos muchas palabras cotidianamente para eso. Y hablamos con diminutivos que tienen que ver con el cariño a las cosas. Entonces es la plantita, ¿no? Y tiene que ver el agüita, cosas que son tratar con cariño los recursos. Y eso ocurre cotidianamente, y entonces nos ocurre que luego al vincularnos con otras personas de otros pueblos, también nos entendemos. Y nos entendemos desde ese respeto, ¿no? Yo, a raíz de las preguntas que sugirieron para estas reflexiones, pensaba en cómo confluyeron, o sea, cómo incluso con la experiencia colonial, con el dolor que trae la colonia, cómo las personas africanas, de origen africano, logran hacer de esto también su territorio. Y lo primero que pensé fue que en la cosmovisión andina existe esta Pachamama, esta madre tierra, que entonces te permite hacer a ti también ser parte, ser hijo, hija de esta madre tierra. Y existe este Huiracocha, creador de todo, que es un personaje que es incluso antes de los incas, y es un personaje con dos serpientes a los costados, agarrando dos serpientes, y con un tocado que es un sol. Y entonces lo ves y dices, puede ser Oshumare, está ahí también, ¿no? Y luego el hecho de que aquí los cerros, o sea, la colonia puso cruces en todos los cerros grandes, pero los pueblos indígenas lo que usan son apus, se habla con el cerro, se le pide al cerro, se pide al cerro que resguarde a la ciudad, se pide al agua que baje, se le canta al agua para que baje y pueda regar los cultivos, ¿no? También, y entonces los propios pueblos originarios de esta zona del Abya Yala también habían sostenido el vínculo con el territorio. Y creo que permite tanto en un intercambio precolonial como en el intercambio postcolonial el retejernos. Y creo que Mónica al inicio lo nombraba, esta sanación, porque es reconocer que la colonia nos impuso dolores en el cuerpo, y dolores que tenemos que tejernos para volver a armar, para volver a sentir, para poder expresar nuestro ritmo, nuestra forma de hablar, el cómo movemos el cuerpo al hablar, con libertades, ¿no? Entonces me parecía como algo que quería traer, ¿no? Que aquí nosotros desde este territorio, el sol es una deidad que es Inti, la luna también tiene un sentido que es la quilla, el Iyapa que es el rayo, ¿no? Y que nos permite seguir siendo naturaleza, y que el cuerpo es territorio, lo dicen mucho los pueblos indígenas, nuestro cuerpo es territorio. Y por eso los protegemos del extractivismo, de la agroindustria. Por eso todavía tenemos que salir a manifestarnos, ¿no? Y organizarnos. Porque no es solo que se está acabando el agua, sino que con eso se pone en riesgo nuestras vidas directamente.
Before moving on, Kobina, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to these two wonderful panelists who offered very powerful and impactful statements. And I think that there's a perfect transition here into the next wave of our conversation, but I definitely want to make sure that we hear from you if there's any immediate reactions based off of what Elisa and Monica just shared.
No, that's for me, it's good. Let's move.
So
we got the point.
Absolutely. So Elisa, thank you so much for sharing, and Monica as well, because I think that this brings us to a perfect place in our conversation to talk about retentions, right? When we're talking about the identity, when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking so much about the stripping away of culture, the stripping away of identity. But in actuality, there within the culture, even, you know, when we're getting into the levels of identity, and Elisa touched on this, when she was talking about Quechua, there's a cultural influence, there's a cultural retention, regardless of a DNA retention. And we see that across all of Latin America. So when we talk about African retentions, I'd like for the group to share what they've learned. You know, Monica kicked us off with saying, you know, if you don't know, now you know. Chata is African origin, right? And so what are these retentions that we have within our cultures that could not and would not be stripped away by colonialism? So I'd like us to kind of, in the effort and in the spirit of reclaiming identity and reclaiming the culture, just kind of go around and talk a little bit about that and talk about how these communities were able to do that despite their circumstances. And I open that up to anybody to start.
Well, I think that we touched on it a little bit in session one, but the pretensions, again, and I love the map first and foremost, because again, it shows where we're coming from the African continent. Oftentimes when we speak about Ghana specifically, you know, there's a couple of things to take note of. Majority of the Africans that left the continent during the Atlantic slave trade, majority of them didn't actually come from Ghana, but majority of them had to come through Ghana. Ghana holds the most slave forts throughout the whole continent. And so regardless of where you were coming from on the continent, you had to come through Ghana as the last place that our ancestors kind of saw and felt before they got to the Americas and whatever. So Ghana has a motto called, you know, the gateway into Africa, because it is literally the gateway, that was literally the gateway out of Africa. And a lot of the retentions that we see, so we're having a, you know, again, we're talking about so many different tribes, cultural beliefs, spiritual beliefs, all coming together and being put in these spaces, these geographical spaces. They're all coming from the African continent. And so the retentions are so, they vary, they're so diverse, because again, we're not talking about a monolithic group coming from the continent. We're talking about different tribes from, you know, from all over the continent being placed in these spaces. And some of the retentions that we see, and it can be as simple as pouring libation, for instance. If you come to Ghana, you know, you're still going to see folks that pour libation and reverence to the ancestors. You know, they'll show the alcohol, which again, the alcohol is what we call spirits, right, or spirit. And so our spirit we lift up to the Creator, and then, you know, we say something like, you know, we're showing our spirit to you before we pour the libation on the ground to the ancestors. The notion behind that is, you know, we show our spirit to you, but you don't directly take our spirit. You know, the ancestors intercede on our behalf. So, you know, we go through the ancestors and we pour the libation. Now you contrast that with, let's say, just folks, whether it's in the Afro Latinx community or the African American community, who might, you know, pour some liquor on the floor. They're not necessarily thinking about, the Creator or the ancestors, but they say, let's pour a little liquor for the boys upstate, for instance, the boys in prison or something like that. Again, so these retentions are there. The meaning might start to disappear. I love the movie Roots, I believe it was, and how you see the culture. They have the retentions, you know, the first people that come to the Americas. That's why I hate the whole idea of this notion that we keep hearing Africans sold us into slavery. And regardless of what you want to think about it, that phrase itself, that saying sold us, I'd rather say if they sold us, it should be they sold themselves. Because when you say sold us, it immediately divides us, right? Like there's a separate group and they did this to us, rather than, you know, saying they sold us. And now once you say that, then it's like, well, why would we do it to ourselves? Now it gets a little complicated. You want to get into the story a little bit more to understand what really happened. So these retentions exist because we are the same people, right? That are in these indigenous spaces. In the movie, you start to see the first people hold on to these retentions they remember, but as generations go on, as Sister Monica is saying, they're still holding on to it. There's a scene in the movie, you know, in every series, they're holding up the baby. This is like a naming ceremony that they do in Africa, where they hold up the baby and they say all these, you know, they show the baby to the ancestors. And throughout the series, you start to see how the wording starts to change. And so, because they're forgetting how to word the ceremony. And by the time you get to the end of Roots, they've completely forgotten even why they hold the baby up, but they still do it, right? They've completely, the memory, right, is gone. But they understand that it's something that, you know, the ancestors did, so we have to do. We may have lost meaning, but it's something that's there. And that's really what it's about, is these sort of retentions you could see and how we are, as I said, a communal people. That in and of itself is a retention, because we're going up against a system that is consistently trying to individualize us in their bureaucratic ways and in their capitalistic ways. And so oftentimes, you know, it's hard for even Africans on the continent to really, in the name of progress and development, catch up to that, because we're, you know, in order to move forward in this kind of capitalistic society where you're not your brother or your sister's keeper, in our communities, we are our brothers and sisters keepers. That's how we you know, we live in our communal spaces. So case in point, you won't have, if you come to Africa, you know, on the continent, it'll be hard for you to find an old people's home, for instance, right? Because we never had in our mentality that, you know, when the elderly, you know, when they get old or they get sick, that you kind of put them in the old people's home. No, we take care of the community, because again, it's a communal society, right? And so we take care of our people, you know, and the same thing, you know, it's just recently that you would start to see orphanages that are coming up. And that too, most people attribute to the kind of westernized mentality that is coming to the continent. Because again, your child was never your child was for the community. And so, you know, I had a right to discipline your child because your child was our child. And so you see these retentions still in, you know, in the diaspora where, you know, we have it, but because we're wrestling against the individualistic, bureaucratic, capitalistic system of Westernism, that, you know, it challenges our morals. And the problem is not that Westernism is wrong, but what happens is that when it's being imposed on others who may have a different, you know, it's sort of imposed as a universal thing, right? But, you know, and it's not acknowledging that, you know, there are people that have different morals and values that might not look like Western or European morals and values, and yet that shouldn't be demonized or degraded or considered primitive or backwards or anything like that. So we can go on and on in terms of those African retentions as it relates to our spirituality, but also, as you know, Sister Monica said, in terms of the food, you know, we call it fried plantain, you know, you could call it platanos, you know, whatever it is, you know, these are things that, you know, we carry wherever we go. And it is really interesting, you know, if we're coming from Africa, once you start talking about Pan-Africanism, the reason why I brought that first question up was, you know, it's always like, well, if that's the case, you can always relate things back to Africa, right? And, you know, because everybody originated in Africa. Here we go with Africa again and trying to claim Africa, you know. But, you know, what does it really mean in terms of Pan-Africanism? The notion of we can't fight the plagues of white supremacy, the plagues of, you know, colonization and slavery in isolation. We have to find a way to come together in order to do that. And so, you know, using these retentions as identifying marks to show that, look, there is a connection. We are the same people. We may look different, but, you know, we come from this one space. And like I said, if you have a common root, we have a common destiny. It's clear we have a common enemy. How do we come together to not necessarily fight, but do what we need to do in order to find liberation for ourselves? If we continue to fight this fight in isolation, we're going to keep on getting the same results. The worst, what's funny is they don't ever do that in isolation. They know when to come together, have the Berlin Conference, share the African continents amongst themselves, then go back into their isolation. We need to do sort of the same thing. We need to come together and understand that we're one people, do what we need to do to liberate ourselves from the dependency, and even the notion of progress and development needs to change. And once we start to tap into our own morals and values, we'll be able to do that. So you do see the retentions of the morals, the values, our religion. Again, just bring in the spirituality aspect. You can go into the Black church, and whilst they're demonizing, African spirituality, when you can be in that same fundamental Christian church and Black church and see African spirituality all throughout, whether you want to call it them catching the Holy Spirit or whatever they're talking about, and so I always contrast, the Afro Latinx community, who doesn't necessarily have a problem with identity per se, because they understand that they're indigenous spaces and claim that. Contrast that with maybe African Americans who struggle heavily with their identity or being comfortable with that space. And I think that's what this whole conversation is about, is if you are comfortable with your heritage, with your culture, with where you come from as indigenous folks, yet still see these retentions, is it necessary for you to recognize them, reclaim these, Africa as yours, and then see what possibilities, whether spiritual, economic, or political possibilities that can come from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to just, before we take that, you gave us so much. Thank you. I want to just be able to hear from Elisa and Monica on, from your lived experience, what are some of those retentions that perhaps maybe early on you didn't even know were African retentions and you later came to learn that, or that you did always know were African retentions and were valued? So please, any one of you.
Sí, yo quería ahí compartir que mientras escuchaba a Covina, sentía que estabas narrando parte de mi vida. Cuando hablas de este sentido de los viejos, los ancianos, no son abandonados. No lo son. Finalmente nos organizamos dentro del núcleo familiar para ver quiénes tomamos roles de cuidado. Hace pocos días justo fue mi cumpleaños y conversaba con mi familia. Les agradecía a todas las mujeres de mi familia que contribuyeron a mi crianza, porque realmente nos criaron en colectividad. Mi recuerdo es ese, ¿no? Yo vivía en un barrio obrero muy precario, en donde abríamos las puertas en la mañana y todas las casas, si no éramos familiares, era gente que era la comadre, ¿no? Algún vínculo se había creado y les permitía a todas llamarnos la atención, no dejarnos ir más lejos, avisarle a nuestra madre, a la abuela, a la tía, lo que estábamos haciendo. Y entonces vivíamos con las puertas abiertas y los niños y niñas del barrio entraban y salían de las casas y solo nos dispersábamos para almorzar y volvíamos a estar en todos los espacios comunes, jugando, ¿no? Y entonces es algo que aquí todavía se mantiene, tal cual como lo has planteado, las políticas neoliberales, ¿no? Que van individualizando a las ciudades, al territorio, que van construyendo cada vez más edificios, quitando el espacio público, nos obligan a retraernos, ¿no? A volver al núcleo más chico. Pero aún así, la gente todavía busca el mudarse cerca, porque es la única forma de poder criar o de cuidar a los viejos después, ¿no? Porque si yo vivo a 2 cuadras de mis padres, puedo ir y venir todos los días un momento a dar la mano. Y lo decimos así, te doy la mano, ¿no? Te apoyo, voy, cocino, vuelvo. Entonces creo que esas redes de solidaridad, por lo menos en este lado, se mantienen. Y es realmente bonito, porque te da esta sensación del, no voy sola, ¿no? No es que trabajo todos los días para yo alimentarme, sino es trabajo porque lo que yo haga también influencia a mi manada más cercana, a mi grupo más cercano y también al grupo más extenso. Creo que ese es algo en donde he reconocido muchísimo este aporte que traía, ¿no?, a la reflexión cubina. Al mismo tiempo siento que África vive en Perú, y vive en Perú porque vive musicalmente, lo necesitamos que la música, que la comida, que el encuentro sea celebrado, sea el espacio en donde es un festejo. O sea, literalmente en Perú tenemos un ritmo de música afroperuana que se llama festejo. Ese es el nombre, ¿no? Y entonces nos permite celebrar, e incluso son músicas que se llaman festejo y que hay canciones que son para funerales, y que entonces aun cuando ha fallecido alguien de nuestro grupo, bailaremos. Bailaremos y brindaremos, y lo decía también Comina, cuando nosotros aquí brindamos, tanto los indígenas como la población afroperuana, el primer sorbo de alcohol que vas a beber, lo das al suelo. Y se dice, ¿no? Primero, o para mis muertos, o dices, o para la pachita, para la tierra. Y se entrega primero a ella, y después recién podemos tomar. Y ocurre una cosa que en tiempos de COVID ha sido un conflicto cultural y de sanidad, que es el compartir el vaso. Entonces nosotros bebemos y tú tomas, y luego le pasas el mismo vaso a la otra persona, y tiene que tomar del vaso, porque genera vínculo de confianza. Estás compartiendo tú, ¿no? O sea, parte de ti con la otra persona. Y claro, el COVID nos planteó ya no se puede hacer esto, y entonces nos veías a todos en grupo como ¿ahora qué hacemos? No, ya te paso un vaso limpio, pero te vuelvo a pasar yo un vaso y la botella de donde vas a beber, ¿no? Entonces creo que sí, que siguen vivos aquí, se mantienen, ¿no?
Yeah, and I would just expand on that. I want to uplift what Kobina and Eliza both shared, especially on things that we may not realize, like plantains, platinos, when it comes to funerals, whether it's within Latin America or folks who identify like culturally as Black. When we have wakes, we always say, oh, we're going to turn up. We're going to wake the ancestors up. So we're going to be playing the music, all the songs. You're going to be kicking it with your cousins till 2 a.m. because it's all about celebrating the life. And so I think like that is a retention. And then also just expand, because it is February 2nd, and historically we've called February Black History Month. And as we continue to expand, we are also calling it Black Futures Month, because we've been denied of even dreaming into the future. So what does retention look like through a futuristic lens? And so I'm going to take it back to I'm going to take it up to, everything that has been uplifted and shared here, and then expand on that in terms of okay, we are collectively here now. What does it look like in terms of the new identities that we are forging for each other from the lack of access to our historical, cultural, and ancestral knowledge and wisdom? And so for me, I'm thinking again, why I call myself Afro-Chicana, because as I work to reclaim, there's parts of my identities like, yes, I am Native American. Yes, I'm indigenous of all of the diaspora, all of the diasporic lineages. And also what is my direct relationship, and recognizing that even my direct relationship, even if it doesn't look like what has been conditioned or taught to us as indigeneity, is a part of that path, because that is our shared lineage and it looks different for many folks. And then in terms of like new identities and culture, I really strongly identify, if y'all just maybe in the chat box say like, yes, you're part of Chicano, Chicanx, culture, you have a familiar with like this part of your upbringing as well, let me know. And like in this new culture that, you know, has been, it's like, this is considered come from the brown rights movement. But when you think about Chicano culture, when you think about lowrider culture, when you think about the shoes they're wearing, Cortez, when you think about the music they're playing, you know, lowrider music, San Jose on a Sunday, you're listening to Smokey Robinson, Bloodstone. Those are Black musicians, but we call that Chicano culture. But you see, like in this new forging of this new way, we are collectively coming together to reclaim our identities in a shared path. And so just really want to uplift, you know, what it is, how are we retaining our culture as we forge new pathways for each other? Because oftentimes we, again, just want to say like, this is this person's culture, this is that, but there's so much shared wisdom, knowledge, and lineage that we are cross-pollinating with one another. And I really just want to uplift that from this more, or from a modern, quote unquote, modern lens, because oftentimes when traditionally I have removed myself from the conversation, not in terms of like physically, but like in terms of not seeing myself in the conversation because it wasn't my direct lived experience. And so what does a direct lived experience look like in terms of how are we reclaiming our sovereignty through music and sound? How are we reclaiming our sovereignty through, you know, reclaiming our cultural foods that, you know, these were considered scraps, but we've reclaimed it into like our Sunday feasts? You know, how are we reclaiming, you know, our relationship with foods that, you know, there's this conversation on, you know, don't eat corn anymore, it's GMOs, it's not healthy, but there is a shared relationship of corn from Mexico to the African diaspora. And so what does that look like in our modern day to look at just an invitation, and I'm going to do this for myself too, it's just to spend the day with yourself, to spend the day with your community and just see the different things that you do that you didn't previously think, like, I wonder where this comes from. Maybe this actually is part of something beyond what I've been told. And so really invite yourself to, you know, see what ways are you retaining the pieces of our shared African lineage that cross-pollinates through Latin America.
Monica, I love that you mentioned Black Futures Month, because actually at CCCADI right now, we're kicking off February with this hybrid notion. And what you're saying is that Sankofa idea, right? A Black History Month is a Black Futures Month, and a Black Futures Month is a Black History Month. And also it's not 1 month, it's what we live, right? So it's all the time. And so looking back in order to look forward is critical, right? And it's key. And the other part that you touched upon is the music and how universal that is in terms of the origin of music, that across Latin America and the US and other parts of the diasporas, the music originates with that drum beat from Africa, right? And it's such a universal thing, and it's something that innately everybody knows and recognizes. And so thank you for bringing that forward and to combine the two. I just humble plug. CCCADI is doing Black Futures Month and kicking off actually a 5-month series that highlights Black music and that as the thread across the diaspora. And so it's just a perfect synergy in what you're talking about when we talk about African retentions. And there's something in the chat that someone, I want to, bring this forward, that someone mentioned, and it's in seeing those connections, right? And I love that Monica offered this idea and this time as an opportunity for folks to reflect on the mannerisms, those cultural behaviors, and ask, where did they come from? And have those conversations with your families as well, right? Because there's one narrative that we have and it's on one surface. And when you dig a little deeper, you realize it's a different narrative. And so we see in the chat here that someone talked about how working with multicultural coworkers for 25 years, they saw that Puerto Rican food and Jamaican food, Barbados, Trinidad, DR, Cuba, it's all the same food, right? It's all the same food with a little bit of a twist. And there's connection in that.
We're a little spicier on the continent. That's all it is.
Right? It's all the same food. And I love that we're finding these connections, because I think that when we talk about the objective of the series, objective of the spiritual pilgrimage, it's about the connection, right? It's a spiritual reconnection. And so I want to encourage the participants to start putting in your questions in that question and answer section. You can find it on the bottom of the screen. And we want to definitely hear from participants and field those questions over to you guys. And we have a question now. If you don't mind, I'd like to offer it up, unless there's something you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just touch
Sure.
on, because I love how Sister Monica brought in, the future aspect, and, in case we don't get to that.
Yeah.
You spoke about Wakanda and the Black Panther movement and all that. And, it's interesting how, whether that's supposed to be a futuristic thing, especially now, that's, after watching movies like that, and we're seeing this Pan-African spirit, and folks are really, starting to, again, did the Year of Return in Ghana in 2019, and we had folks just coming in, and really, with such a movie, it made us feel like, okay, this is actually possible. This is what it should look like when, Africans really, come together all over the world, and we really put our minds together, and we're not, we're sort of decolonized, and we're not necessarily with, we're on our own. We're not really influenced by Westernism. What was funny is that, a lot of what we were seeing was heavily influenced by Westernism, whether it was the buildings, whether it was, the notion of technology on the continent. I love what Sister Elisa was saying when we're talking about nature. Something in Africa, our ancestors called African electronics, where we always understood that we were electric and there was electricity in everything, in all of nature. That was different from saying technology, right? That wasn't necessarily technology. How we interpreted, and this is from a lot of the African traditionalists and spiritualists that watch movies like the Wakanda, when they're talking about vibranium and all this technology, we're looking at it more as spirituality, right? Which is different. So there's a difference between being able to, talk or use the cell phone and then have telepathy, right? And there's a difference between creating, planes to travel from one space to another, and then understanding, and maybe you can tap your feet 2 times and then you're at your destination.
Yeah.
Understanding the spiritual aspects. But this is what that challenge that our ancestors and the wisdom that they left us. This is what is challenging us today, is how are we able to go back into deep spirituality, where we understand that we transcend this sort of technological, materialistic things that are oftentimes very influenced by Westernism and Europeanism. And that's what we're looking at as, okay, that's our progress, that's our development, and somehow we find our spirituality in that. I do want to challenge folks, as Sister Monica was also challenging folks, is how do we start to really look at spirituality as something that is really transcendent of our materialistic, and once you start going into nature, and I think that's what it is. Once we start to understand our own connections, that we are literally an embodiment of nature. Our ancestors understood that everything from the soil in the ground to the sun, and the heavens, that we are an embodiment of all of that, to the water, all of that makes us. We have something, in Africa, and that's another retention, respect for our seniors, our elders, right? That exists on the continent and exists in the diaspora, where we have our respect for our elders, regardless of, how silly they may sound. As if you're younger than them, you gotta respect them, and that's something that you don't see. And we could do a whole bunch of contrast between what our identifying marks are and what Westernism and Europeanism values and morals, and the way that has kind of shifted our thought process. But I do think that, just before we get into that question, I do think that it's important to touch on what really does our future look like if we indeed tap into those ancestral spaces, African ancestral spaces, the indigenous spaces, what they were looking at, and where did we go wrong? Sometimes, we have to, when we're also going back, we also have to see where did, some of our ancestors become a little more materialistic, a little more, what happened there. We might sometimes look at that from the spaces that we're in and glorify that, right? Because that's, again, the ideas of progress and development. But what does it really mean for those first peoples who were absolutely in tune with nature, who were spiritual people, right? Because sometimes when I'm dealing with some of these spiritualists on the continent, they always say, well, we can show you better than we can tell you, right? Because a lot of these things aren't things that they can really say, that you have to see it to understand that we haven't tapped into anything, in terms of our spirituality and the possibilities and the things that we could do that our ancestors did before us and that we're trying to get back to. But I think the only way we do that is collective, because there's, when we're looking at some of our differences, it's not necessarily differences that are supposed to separate us, but it's actually differences that we kind of lost in different spaces, and we need to come together, reclaim it as knowledge that kind of dispersed amongst all these different people, try to reclaim it.
And learn from another.
Right,
yeah.
And then we can use it as wealth to be shared amongst us to move us into the future.
Absolutely, absolutely, in community. Kobina, thank you so much for offering that. And I think there's so much to jump into in there. We do unfortunately have to say goodbye to Monica, who has provided so much rich insight from her perspective. So I just want to give Monica an opportunity to give us some last words before she has to go. Thank you so much, Monica, for all that you've offered. And please, anything that you'd like to add before hopping off.
Yeah, thank you so much. And beyond this being a learning space, this is definitely a healing space for folks who, like myself, are reclaiming our representation in Latin America. It's so easy to talk about white supremacy, but when we're talking about it with other folks who identify as part of BIPOC, it's always that struggle of, how do we see ourselves even within other marginalized groups? So I just want to say thank you to all of the people who brought their voices here and all the people who held space for us in the chat box. And in terms of Black futures, in honor of Black futures is also giving us the future to see through our own lived experience. So, recognizing like that this is a beautiful group, and often like I want to be able to travel with like-minded folks who center Blackness. So I'm thinking about, oftentimes when there's like immersive experiences for like immersive traveling experience, talking about the role of the African diaspora is often like something you just kind of add in addition to, but it's really glossed over. but to be a part of a group of folks who are centering that in the experience and immersing that is really beautiful. And I have a lot of gratitude for this space for cultivating that, because I wish people like myself, people like my mom, people like my grandmother would be able to have experiences like this, so they could see the vastness of our lineage and the shared commonalities that we have within one another. Because when we're able to see ourselves, we're able to create the shifts that we want to see. So thank you everyone for this learning experience. I'm super blessed to be a part of this group, and I cannot wait to hear about the next series. And I wish you all abundant success, bliss, beauty, bounty, all of the things that you need in order to continue to thrive. So thank you, everyone.
Ah, sure.
All
Thank you
of
so
the-
much, Monica.
Okay, peace, everybody.
Thank you.
I mean, with that said, Monica's talking about us doing the work in here of healing generational trauma, right? Of breaking those cycles. So Elisa, I want to give you a chance to respond to all that Kobina had to offer when we talk about those differences, and utilizing those differences to build bridges instead of separation.
Sí, justo mientras iba dándose la conversación, creo que hay algo maravilloso en este concepto o ya este modelo, ¿no? Sankofa, de ser pasado, ser presente y ser futuro en una. Y creo que además porque es fundamental en una conexión espiritual que trasciende lo que Occidente nos ha enseñado, ¿no? Occidente nos ha enseñado que la espiritualidad se rinde en un recinto cerrado, con toda una parafernalia inmensa, ¿no? Y con un señor diciéndonos qué hacer. Y creo que gran parte de conectar con la espiritualidad y que nos permite transitar y romper el tiempo, ¿no? Porque es romper el tiempo lineal para hacer ciclos, para que todo sea parte de lo mismo. Es estas conexiones muy cotidianas, pero muy cotidianas de, lo decía Covina, el respeto a los mayores, porque hay un dicho en castellano, ¿no? Más sabe el diablo por viejo que por diablo. Y ahí pensaba en la organización En Presencia y Palabra, cuando la fundamos, fue una intención real el convocar a las mujeres que habían fundado el movimiento negro en el Perú, para trabajar con ellas primero. Porque habían muchas jóvenes con mucho tiempo y mucha posibilidad de sumarse a la organización, pero todas desde el ímpetu del ya quiero hacer. Y lo que decidimos fue frenar eso y decir, no, llamemos a las mayores. Sin memoria, no caminamos a ningún lado. Y entonces, como parte incluso de estas formas de organizarnos, teníamos a nuestra Diabla Mayor, además así le pusimos. Y porque aquí hay una danza afroperuana que es el son de los diablos, que funciona para los carnavales, ¿no? Entonces la gente sale a bailar, y lo que hacían en realidad era que la población afroperuana entraba a las iglesias y se llevaba estas cajas donde se ponía la limosna, y con eso hacían un instrumento de percusión. Y salían a bailar en tiempo de carnaval, con máscaras de diablo. Y dentro de esos hay diablos mayores y diablos menores, que respetan una jerarquía ancestral. Entonces en la organización empezamos con las mujeres mayores y teníamos la Diabla Mayor, y cuando la Diabla Mayor hablaba, el resto realmente escuchábamos. Podíamos discutir todo, pero era desde el respeto, está hablando ella. Y entonces nos permitió encontrar una dinámica orgánica, o sea, que quizás no era consciente, solo se fue dando, y que funcionó, que fue partir de respetar que esas mujeres habían caminado mucho más antes, se habían enfrentado a otros tiempos y habían construido formas de puentes, y había un llamado que era el conectemos desde la memoria. Conectemos desde el ser primero amigas, el conectar y confiar. Y creo que eso ha sido muy importante también en mi proceso formativo y de hacerme adulta. El encontrar también a estas otras mujeres negras con capacidad de guiar, sin imponer, ¿no? Guiando pero sin imposición, guiando desde el afecto, guiando con reniegos, con llamadas de atención, pero sin imponer. Y pensaba en cómo esos también son formas de sostenernos culturalmente, ¿no? De seguir llamándonos y construir futuros y construir puentes, no solo entre la población afrodescendiente, sino con las poblaciones indígenas también, con las poblaciones mestizas, porque es una realidad. O sea, no podemos negar y pelearnos con los mestizos o las mestizas todo el tiempo, sino tenemos que conectar, porque en abrazarse, en el mestizaje, también está el abrazar de alguna forma estas prácticas antinegras, antiindígenas, coloniales, pero necesitamos conversar. Y creo que por eso también tenía la intención de iniciar con Victoria Santa Cruz, nombrándola, ¿no? Dándole un espacio para que sea parte de esta conversación. Victoria, hubo un momento en que ella descubre, ¿no? O se encuentra, como dicen, se encuentra con el ritmo, como la llave de sanación, la llave desde donde va a poder enfrentarse al mundo, y no para destruirlo. De hecho, ella dice, ¿no? La primera vez que me di cuenta lo que era ser negra para ellos, ¿no? Odié. Y odié tanto, dice, que si me hubieran puesto una pistola, yo mataba blancos. Dice, pero me di cuenta que ese no era el camino, que no era contra ellos, sino era en mí. Tenía que descubrir quién en mí se enojaba, quién en mí estaba dolida, quién en mí estaba reaccionando. Y justo Victoria también plantea la idea de, en la reacción solo hay pasado, por lo tanto no es real, sino que tenemos que encontrar la acción. La acción, y en la acción, que es la experiencia, no puede haber error. Vas a encontrar muchas emociones, pero vas a seguir creando. Estás creando, y por lo tanto, si creas, estás en conexión con todo, ¿no? Y estar en conexión implica conectar con tu propio ritmo. Saber que tu corazón, en el acto más crudo, ante una arritmia, te mueres. Entonces necesitas sostener tu ritmo. Y el ritmo solo puede ser compartido, solo puede ser experimentado en comunidad. Y creo que Victoria Santa Cruz ha dado un aporte inmenso a la reconexión justo de Perú, África, de Perú y el continente africano, pero además de Perú y la humanidad. Y porque ella misma en sus palabras en algún momento lo dice, inicié luchando por la gente negra, y me di cuenta que la lucha no era por ellos nada más, sino era por la especie humana, por dejar realmente de separarnos y encontrar esos puntos que nos unen aún en tensión, ¿no? Porque si no, tal cual, nos dividimos y no llegas a una unidad. Siempre serás una división. Entonces creo que ahí hay claves muy potentes, hay enseñanzas, y que a mí, desde que me vinculé con el pensamiento de Victoria Santa Cruz, lo que hice fue ponerla en práctica. Así, simple, no la pensé, no le di más teoría, solo fue voy a probarlo. Voy a probar hacer música, tocar un instrumento, vincularme a la percusión, bailar de manera más consciente, de resentir qué en mí se mueve y qué con eso podemos compartir con otras personas también. Entonces creo que hay mucho por tejer. Creo que además yo tuve la suerte de estar en Guatemala hace unos años, viviendo un tiempo ahí, y fue un país que también, como ya dicen, me acuerpó. Y eso es algo que busco, ¿no? El acuerpamiento que dicen en Guatemala es muy real, que es el hacernos cuerpo, dejar de ser, ¿no?, fragmentos y en grupo hacerse uno. Y hacerse una para cuidarse, y hacerse una para disfrutar, y hacerse una para vivir. Entonces, creo que ahí hay muchos conocimientos que entre los pueblos nos podemos reconocer y nos permite justo tender puentes de manera muy orgánica y de manera muy como son los niños, las niñas, ¿no? Intuitivas, más que racionales, sino realmente de sentir que la vibra está y que nos permite ser buenas personas. Entonces sí me gustaría para llegar ahí.
Thank you, Elisa. And this brings us, Kobita, this perfectly brings us into our questions. And Elisa touched a lot upon, the work in what the question asked, which is, how do we begin to combat and or work around those of us, the people of color, who outright express a lack of desire to center racial healing and unity? O sea, there's a community of people within the Latino community that express a lack of desire to center racial healing and unity. And so how do we combat that, right? How do we work? Maybe combat's not even the right word. How do we work around that? And some of what Elisa offered talked about that. So I'd like to hear from you, what are the ways in which, in particular to the Latino community, which is where the Charlotte who asked the question is centering the conversation, what's the work of anti-Blackness look like within the community that is resistant to hear and begin that conversation?
Yeah. Well, first, again, we're doing the work right now.
That's right.
Is these type of conversations, not just again from reflection, but also moving to praxis. Is that we want to see. It's easy to talk about. Well, it's not easy, obviously, to have these type of genuine and raw conversations to really pinpoint what the issues are. Again, when we're putting this together, when Ghana called, again, during the 400 years, and we're seeing all this suffering, all this oppression, especially from 2019 going into 2020, when we called on the year of return for all folks to come in from all over the Pan-African world. What we, again, we went to the Caribbean, we went to Cuba and Colombia, we went to all these other Afro Latinx communities. And the reason why this whole conversation and why we're having this discussion with CCCADI is because we noticed that there was something missing with the Afro Latinx community in terms of how we come into the Pan-African space in the 21st century. Initially, I don't think we paid attention to it because initially we were looking at that we thought that it was just African Americans that needed healing. We weren't necessarily, we felt as, okay, well, the Afro Latinx community was quite grounded in their identities, and they weren't necessarily looking at Africa. We didn't notice that actually that was the problem right there, was that, that there is this anti-Blackness that exists within the Afro Latinx community. And to be honest, as Sister Elisa is speaking, I'm like, it's hitting me, I'm recognizing that, this exists in the community. It's a real thing. You do see it, hidden within maybe the wrestle between Dominicans and Haitians, for instance. You kind of see it hidden in those spaces that, okay, there's a problem here. This is an anti-Black thing going on over here. Does it extend to the continent? And so I think one of the things that we're doing is having these conversations and really pinpointing that there is a problem. I like what James Baldwin says, that, you know, remembering the past, the horror, the trauma, and all of that isn't the same as drowning in it, right? Is that you can remember, you know, these things, and because that's where you recognize that there's a problem, there's an issue, there's something that's been stripped away. But at the same time, our ancestors resisted and understood and managed to still hold these African retentions for generations to come to look at and say, no, actually, we are the same people. We still have these connections. We're not totally disconnected. And so what we're trying to do here is tap into the similarities, tap into the identifying marks, you know, really gain a consensus that we are one Pan-African family. We know where the problem came from, and we know the plagues of white supremacy have kind of infiltrated our spaces where, you know, I think a question came last week was how do we remove ourselves from the notion of struggle, right? And how, and you know, how do we start to have conversations with ourselves rather than, you know, always having to reach back and talk about certain trauma. It's really a futuristic, you know, approach that we're taking now with this program, with, you know, these type of discussions, and then having the gall, the nerve, the courage, and the faith to actually see whether these discussions and these reflections can translate on the ground, right? So that when we do, if you're really about it, and really that's what we're doing, right? We're calling people out here. We're saying, okay, let's have these discussions, but at the same time, it's easy to be in our comfort space, talk about these things, and then go right back into the world. But how, you know, as Sister Elisa was talking about bodies, our movement, you know, how do our Black and brown bodies come together? The feeling aspect of it, you know, is different from the intellect, right? And so how do we make term reflection into praxis? And this is why we're making sure that by the end of these conversations are supposed to lead us to get an understanding of some of our issues, you know, some of the things that we need to tap into, some of the similarities that we have. How do we use even we know the similarities, but how do we even use our differences as wealth that's supposed to be shared amongst us to combat some of our issues and some of the healing? And, you know, coming on the ground, touching the continent, touching the ancestors from the origins, not the indigenous spaces, but from the origins. What exactly does that do for us? And, you know, we've been doing these tours, these spiritual pilgrimages for a while now. It's always amazing how, you know, there's, you know, an interesting connection that people, sometimes it's an epiphany for folks once they get on the land that, oh, I didn't even know that this space needed to be filled. I didn't even know that there was a void over here, or that, you know, there was this connection over here. And the idea is how we're tailoring this trip to make sure that whether it's the music, whether it's the drumming, whether it's the dancing, whether it's the food, what all these retentions, the culture, how we greet one another, just the communal, you know, communal space, how we recognize that, again, we feel each other in these spaces, and that in and of itself, it has some really liberating aspects. So as it relates to healing, you know, you got to identify, you know, these wounds that exist that, you know, Sister Elisa really spoke on, and I'm sure a lot of folks have in the Afro Latinx community. And it's sometimes you do have to go all the way back. And you know, there's a saying that when in doubt, go to the beginning, right? And that's kind of you know, that's a saying that really applies to everything. When in doubt, try to find your way back to the beginning. And I think that's something that we're trying to do And I really appreciate CCCADI for giving us the platform, recognizing that this is necessary, you know, because CCCADI out of all organizations has been doing and you know, and can keep it moving, you know what I mean? But to recognize that, okay, there is, you know, some things that maybe let's go back, you know, Zankofa, let's go back, you know, to the beginning and see how, you know, we can really heal some of the wounds that, you know, Sister Lisa, you know, spoke about, that I'm sure many of the Afro Latinx community, whether they know it or not, you know what I mean? And that's the interesting thing about it, to get the courage to come down, and then you recognize that, oh, I didn't know that I had some of this trauma. I didn't know that some of these things were affecting me in these kind of ways. You know, and as you're saying, the anti-Black, once you come into those spaces, you're forced to confront whatever it is that you thought you were disconnected from. And I think that's really the only way to do it, is to remove, you know, white folks, the struggle that we're having with you know, white supremacy, kind of remove that from the conversation. Focus in, and this is what we're talking about, the future, focus in on ourselves as a community of people, which is something that, you know, the common enemy never wants us to do. And once we do that, I think, you know, we really will have not only liberating aspects, but really spiritual possibilities, things that I think, you know, are long overdue. We have a lot of spirituality and a lot of power in our spaces. What does it mean to come together with this ancestral knowledge, which, you know, and how, and watch how, and I really believe that this is when we start to transcend some of the struggles that we're having in these earthly realities, and, you know, and see the real power that our ancestors left us.
That's right. Oh, Karina, I love all of that, because what you are saying is exactly the purpose of this trip, right? Like, we are not trying to go on a trip just to check off another place, another country, another stamp in the passport. There's meaningful work behind this, right? There's a greater purpose. There's work that is going to carry our communities through the generations to come, right? When we talk about Afrofuturism, this is part of that work. This is not about going somewhere just for the sake of going somewhere. I love that. Thank you so much for bringing that to the table. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to be super respectful of everybody's time, but I do want to squeeze one question in. It's been in the queue for a little bit, and it is from Marisol, directed to Elisa. And the question is, Elisa, in your anthropologic studies or in your spiritual practices, has a particular region and practice resonated most with you? Has a particular region or practice in their spirituality or in your anthropology studies, has it resonated most?
Sí, mira, acá en Perú, bueno, lo decía, ¿no? Somos cerca del 4% de la población la que se autoidentifica como afrodescendiente. Esos son datos oficiales. Sabemos que debemos ser el doble. Pero hay comunidades, me tocó hacer un trabajo justo en el marco del censo nacional, me tocó ir a Piura, que es el norte, es casi frontera con Ecuador. Y siempre se nos había dicho que la población afroperuana estaba en el sur. Pero el censo dijo, justo en la comunidad donde yo estuve, que el 80% de esa comunidad se autoidentificaba como afrodescendiente. Lo que a mí me ocurrió mientras tuve que vivir ahí para hacer esta etnografía fue mágico, o sea, fue entrar a una comunidad que cultiva mango, que cultiva cacao y que vive en torno a la tierra. Están a 1 hora de la ciudad, es muy conectable. Y justo lo que ocurría era como esta lógica del bajo secreto todavía sostener prácticas culturales muy propias, que solo me permitieron conocer cuando ya confiaron en mí, y eso estaba muy bien, porque me lo dijeron, vienen antropólogos, vienen sociólogos, vienen investigadores todo el tiempo, ¿no? Y preguntan y preguntan. Claro, y me miraron y me decían, pero tú solo caminas y caminas y te has conseguido una bicicleta y te vas de un lado al otro en bicicleta y juegas con los niños y las niñas. ¿Sí? ¿Y por qué no preguntas? Me preguntaron a mí, yo le dije, porque necesito conocer qué pasa, ¿no? Le digo, si no, presentaría preguntas desde Lima, desde la capital. Y claro, y entonces me dijeron, ya, entonces acompáñame a tal actividad. Vamos a recolectar mango, vamos a hacer esto. Y empecé a conocer un pueblo que era completamente vinculado a su territorio. Me permitieron entrar a las clases de las escuelas. Y entonces los niños y las niñas se miraban en el espejo y empezaban a decir, qué bonito soy, mi color es así, mi cabello es este, mira mis labios cómo son, mis labios se parecen a los de tal. Y entonces empezó una descripción de amor a sus cuerpos y a su historia, que yo decidí en realidad para fines del trabajo que estaba haciendo, narrar estrictamente lo que el trabajo me pedía. Y sostener la confianza, resguardar la complicidad que ellas me habían permitido de ingresar realmente a espacios muy privados, como hablar de las parteras, ¿no? De si había gente que trabajaba con plantas o no, de cuándo hacían los cultos, todo eso, como en realidad tampoco era parte de lo que a mí me habían pedido en el estudio, yo decidí, por respeto a esa comunidad, también omitirlo, porque creo que en el trabajo antropológico, creo que es importante que, aun cuando es nuestra profesión, también está el otro lado, que es somos personas, y hay pueblos que se han sostenido justo con información que no comparten, porque es un riesgo para su existencia. Y porque la antropología, finalmente, como disciplina formal, es una disciplina colonial, altamente colonial, ¿no? Basada en traducir conocimientos de un pueblo para dárselos a otro. Entonces, creo que cuando nos toca, que ese es un debate en el que yo entro constantemente, nos toca ser antropólogas, antropólogos, desde territorios que han sido colonizados, también tenemos que tener la responsabilidad del qué narramos y a quiénes, y qué es lo que no narraremos, porque es resguardar el derecho de cada pueblo a mantener su cultura, a mantener su espacio privado, ¿no? Y que lo transmitan como transmiten los pueblos el conocimiento, de manera oral o porque estuviste presente, no porque lo leíste siempre en un libro. Y por eso me parece muy importante también este viaje que se plantea, ¿no? Tal como lo plantea Covina. O sea, no es solo recrearse, sino es poder conocer, acuerpar la experiencia para volver en otra dimensión, para poder mirar futuros desde otra experiencia vital, y que eso no se lee, y que eso no se ve en YouTube, no se ve en Instagram, no se ve, eso se vive, y solo a través de experimentarlo creamos realmente el conocimiento. Entonces, creo que en estas experiencias que son más laborales, también hay que tener el resguardo de la parte humana para poder sostener confianzas, que es lo que más se nos ha quebrado posiblemente, ¿no? Con todo el proceso colonial, pero también con todo lo que vivimos actualmente.
That is a beautiful place for us to leave with this energy and with that spirit. And we are coming up at 9:30. So I do want to say thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you so much, Covina. And of course, to Monica, who had to leave a few minutes early. And thank you so much to all of our participants for being engaged, for being here, for being interested in doing the work and interested in taking this journey with us. I do want to remind folks, just as the chat is saying right now, remind folks of all of the resources that are available to them within their accounts. We have a wonderful resource library that has more readings, more content, more context to the 4 conversations that we are having in preparation for our trip. I also want to remind folks that there is a limited space. I mean, we wish we could take everybody, but we do want to make sure that these experiences are curated and meaningful. And so that means that limited space is available. So we want to remind folks and encourage folks to complete that deposit with Godbox, who is going to be phenomenal in walking you through the entire process. And of course, continue to become involved and be live at the following workshops to secure that discount. So with that, I want to thank everybody and offer you guys, the energy that today brought us. And I hope that this creates a little bit momentum for everyone and everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Have a great night.